much, Chris, for this opportunity and direct to talk about this presentation. This project I've just started. I'm very, very excited and also even a bit anxious because this is very much a work in progress, something I started working on a few months ago. And I haven't started my fieldwork yet, so this is the sort of methodological paper which hopefully won't be also a boring paper, but an interesting paper for reflection. And I'm going to talk about something I call the politics of classification. What is the politics of classification? It's, I'm going to talk about how European migrants make distinctions between deserving and undeserving migrants. And I'm going to argue that these distinctions, these symbolic distinctions, reveal differences in social biographies and resources. So I'm going to talk about, in a sense, class differences in a Bourdieusian framework, and I'm going to say a bit more about that later. These distinctions, of course, are drawn between different national groups, but they can also be drawn within national groups, between different kinds of nationals. And this is actually the point I'm going to talk about the most, because I think it has been relatively under-researched in the literature on European migration. And indeed, the paper is, in a sense, a re-examination of the literature on European migration before the crisis and a bunch of more recent studies after the crisis. And what I find interesting in these different studies is that they pretty much reveal very similar distinctions, even if these studies were not about this particular social process. And I'm going to show you that they reveal notions of cosmopolitanism, usually tied to a notion of good taste and notions of meritocracy, and these are used to distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving migrants within the national community. Just a bit of water because I tend to get sore very, very fast. Okay. So just why this is relevant vis-a-vis the Brexit. I think it's relevant because it's a process that is likely to remain important. It's a more general social process. And so I would expect that it will keep hiding differences in migrants' capitals, social profile and experiences, pretty much, well, not regardless of how the Brexit goes, but the questions of trajectories, capitals and classifications, I would say that it will remain important in different migration regimes, which is the uncertainty we are facing now. I'm also going to argue that these studies about European migration and the way migrants classify people reveal a problematic notion of the good migrant as a pretty much adaptable, flexible human capital, and so a person that doesn't really have effective social relationships, or the assumption is these relationships aren't that important. What is important is the skills, the capacity to adapt, the capacity of being successful, in a sense. Okay, so just very quickly, where I'm coming from theoretically with this. I already mentioned Bourdieu, but actually I'm coming from a broader field. I'm a cultural sociologist, basically, and here I'm basically applying a form of cultural class analysis which hones a lot to Bourdieu, but in recent years have been expanded significantly by a variety of scholars, Beverly Skeggs, Michel Lamont in the US, Matthew Desmond, Imogen Tyler, just to name a few of them. And very quickly, these people have paid much more attention to the subjective experience of class and inequality, and they have also expanded Bourdieu's focus towards a more intersectional analysis, so class linked to gender, age, ethnicity and race, and so on. What these different people have in common, however, is an attention to evaluations of cultural practices, but also places and people. And this is how I approached the literature on European migration when I started the project. Because these evaluations reveal a subjective sense of position which is grounded in objective social differences. And I am applying in my research this particular point of view to Italian post-2008 emigration to the UK, So I'm interested in what are the social trajectories of Italian post-crisis migrants, to what extent they possess different degrees of economic, cultural and social capital, and to what extent such differences matters when you look at aspirations, lifestyles and experiences. But I'll say a bit more about the Italian case later. What about the politics of classifications in the broader literature on the European migration? This is not really, as I said, the explicit focus of many studies, but when you look at the literature, especially when samples are sufficiently diversified, you pick up interesting objective and subjective differences. So I'm going to mention just 3 examples about the pre-crisis migration, then I will discuss the post-crisis literature. It's about 3 very different national groups, 3 very different migration waves, but they all reveal the centrality of education and the centrality of lack of education when people evaluate. So for example, the first study is from Laura Morosnau about Romanians in London, and basically she found that highly educated migrants are very keen on staying away from other nationals, the Romanian community as they call it, and are self-consciously cosmopolitan, so they are enjoying the European multicultural network they are embedded in, and they are very keen on stressing that they don't know very much about national culture. For example, they don't listen to Romanian music. It's something that it doesn't represent them. However, she also found that some respondents without university degrees and in low-skill occupations, they actually had a very different lifestyle and experience, much more dominated by economic necessity, and also they weren't self-consciously cosmopolitans, but they were accidentally cosmopolitans. It wasn't something they were looking for, it wasn't part of their narratives of themselves. A very different study from Krings and colleagues about the Poles in Ireland reveals similar differences, especially in this case different motivations for moving and orientations toward work, again related to education and skills. And here what emerges is again a distinction between lifestyle and necessity. And I picked a couple of quotes which I think are particularly significant. The first one is from a low-skill respondent who says, well, in general, we came here for earnings, not to live here nice and beautifully. Whereas the more educated migrants have a much more lifestyle narrative, like in this example which says, I wanted to see something new. It rather wasn't about money, nor that I couldn't find a job in my profession. If you are young, you have to go somewhere. Later on, you may not get the same chance. So there is a very strong contrast here, as in other studies, between necessity and lifestyle. And finally, probably the literature where this is has been explored the most and in an explicit way is the literature on lifestyle migration. The work of Michael, of course, and the work of Caroline Oliver and Karen O'Reilly on Britons in Spain, and which essentially reveals how differences in economic capital shape housing choices and work arrangements, and more crucially how differences in cultural capital, especially embodied cultural tastes, emerge in consumption and lifestyle, which is where the politics of classification really emerges and become prominent. Because we find again a distinction between the cosmopolitans, the self-conscious cosmopolitans, who also single out the uncultured Brits, who of course are associated with the usual stereotypes of British working class culture, the pub, drinking too much, and so on. So there is clearly one evaluating criteria in these narratives which is very important and which I will talk more about later. The concept of cosmopolitan is tied sometimes very implicitly to a concept of good taste. What this evaluative criteria is about, well, how it relates to other narratives. It's usually also about other nationals being provincial or too provincial, not engaging with the local culture, and these nationals are usually associated with both a as I said, national but also low national cultural practices like Romanian music in Morosnau study, pub culture in Oliver. Oh, already 10 minutes. Very quickly. So there is another evaluative criteria which is important, actually, which is meritocracy, which hasn't been perhaps discussed to the same extent. It's a narrative which is tied to notions of hard work or, in the more middle-class variety, talent. For example, in a study of Magdalena Lovchika about Poles in the Midlands and London, migrants made very clear that everyone can make it regardless of skills if you have individual will. And failure, similarly, was conceptualized in individual terms, not in social structural terms. The other Poles they mentioned were too lazy or dishonest. And so the assumption here has, in other studies about the post-crisis, is that migration is not for everyone, but in a sense it's for the best ones. The notion of meritocracy, however, doesn't map straightforwardly on class. And in fact, I argue that it's more like a cultural repertoire, a public discourse that can be mobilized by people with slightly different resources, or also quite different resources. But it does the same job of cosmopolitanism and taste, because it hides differences in social biographies, resources, and experiences. And this is even more important in the studies after the crisis. This is still a very small literature, but it's growing quickly. And it is predominantly about motivations, a bit less about settlement, everyday life, but it's already revealing something which is quite important: the centrality of lifestyle, career, and self-realization in the narratives of the people who have been studied, which is quite interesting because it really contrasts with the tropes of the economic crisis that is being described by, for example, the Italian media, which is more about precarity, lack of employment. You don't really find a lot about that in these particular studies, which I find very interesting. You find, however, the centrality of meritocracy, cosmopolitanism, and good taste again. So, a study about Spanish people in Norway. Here is a quote from a highly educated respondent. I'm not in the Spanish community, I'm not doing the ghetto thing or only go out with Spanish people. So very clearly, cosmopolitanism and a very normative distinction between those who mesh and those who stay within the national community, materially and symbolically. And indeed, cosmopolitanism here goes hand in hand with symbolic distinction and assumption about other Spaniards' relationships and practices. Here is Italy, which is actually not from an academic study, but is from a book from a journalist who is part of the Italian community in London. And he's an interesting case because he's very active in promoting a positive image of the Italian community in London, not elsewhere in the UK. This is very much a narrative about Italians in London. And he describes, again, the other nationals in terms of the Italo trash. Who are the Italo trash? They despise everything that is English, live only among Italians, watch only Italian football, and spend their mornings longing for the cappuccino of their baristas in Milan, Florence, and Naples, without even realizing that they are living in London. So, and he goes on, and he basically argues that the successful Italian migrants combine the best of British culture, they learn from British culture and economy, but still retaining the best of Italian culture. And that means becoming Londonier, which might look like a cultural hybridity sort of argument. You become a new identity, one that mixes different components. However, I think this would be a very problematic interpretation, and it comes up in a couple of studies about the Italian community. I don't really agree with the idea that this is a case of cultural hybridity, because in cultural hybridity, there isn't a hierarchy between different components, whereas here, there is a clear center-periphery dynamic. So being able to become Londonier basically means being able to afford London economically and culturally, and that in a sense offers a very rare form of distinction, especially from all the other nationals that have stayed in Italy for a number of reasons. So, However, as I said, meritocracy is the other evaluative criteria which is very important in these narratives. 5 minutes, very challenging. Basically, especially in the literature about Southern European migrants, you will find narratives about a long-term crisis. So they will talk about corruption in politics and the economy. They will talk about nepotism, family connection, and gerontocracy. They will make the case for no future narratives, because Italy and Spain are so much corrupted that it wasn't the place for them. Now, and by contrast, especially in the Italian case, they will talk about a completely meritocratic labor market based on fair competition, a market that recognizes talent and reward it, and a place where the youth has a possibility, especially in terms of career. And so the UK emerges as a more modern, at the same time, cosmopolitan society. Now, what's the problem with this narrative? I'm not going to argue that this narrative doesn't stem from real experiences of marginalization or even exclusion. However, we have to situate these narratives in a broader analysis of social biographies and social differences. Partly because this is not really, in Italy particularly, this is a widespread media and political discourse, which has been progressively appropriated by different political parties and people in very different material conditions. So it's by no means a controversial argument or the argument of a small community of expats. So I think that it's more helpful to consider it as a cultural repertoire which can be appropriated by people in quite different circumstances. I'm going to skip this kind of example probably, but they are still about the existing literature. They show the ambivalence of the meritocracy narrative. For example, first one is about Italy, one of Russell's students actually. If I stayed in Italy, what were my real perspectives? I had a job with my parents and that is all. Or from the Spanish study, I saw no future in Spain. Of course my family has some means, so I could always have worked with them for one of the many companies they have there, but I didn't want to. I wanted to pursue my own career. So I think we really need to situate the agency and the ethics of these narratives in a broader social analysis, one which is also about asymmetries of resources and privileges, especially in the more recent post-crisis kind of migrations, which might be about people in quite different positions. I'm going to skip that. So my approach is largely Bourdieusian. I'm sure you already have some understanding of capitals and dispositions, because this is becoming an increasingly used approach in migration studies. But what I find interesting here is the notion of social trajectories, that is, how capitals and dispositions change in time, which allows to ground geographical mobility within the study of social mobility or social reproduction, which is actually in Adrian's book Eurostars and Eurocities was a quite important topic. There was a chapter about that. But I really don't think that has become a particularly predominant lens of analysis in discussions of European migration, especially when it comes to differences within national communities. So I'm interested in things like to what extent the mobility project is in line with an education and professional trajectory prepared or even established before, and to what extent mobility is or isn't a part of family history and culture, and how these differences shape respondents' experiences and everyday life. Almost there, thank you. Probably I should also mention that these ideas come also from my own experience in the UK as a first generation mobile in my family, and at the same time first generation graduate and doctor. And that had a very important impact on my understanding of the UK, British academia, and my own experience. So that's why, in a sense, this is where this is coming from personally. But also in the existing data about the Italian social structure and Italian migration, there are very good reasons to look at these differences, particularly differences in kinds of cultural capital, humanities versus business and science degrees. These are very different impact on the quality of work of young graduates in Italy, and I would expect abroad, so I would expect that this is a particularly important difference, along with the difference in family background, which is so important to understand Italian social structure. What is your family economically, but also culturally? And of course, the question of the intersections with gender, ethnicity and race and age. Actually, despite the image of young migrants as a young, the not very good data about Italian migration still suggests a fairly wide age range from the early 20s to the late 40s, mid-late 40s, and I would expect that that will matter, along with the gender, which is already tied to differential access to different degrees, and of course regional differences within Italy, and the fact that actually some migrants apparently are also second generation Italians. So I'm really open to analyze these differences inductively and to look at how they intersect. And I'll end it there. I won't say anything about the Brexit because it's kind of obvious where I'm going to with this. Thank you very much.